you'll see a difference in monuments, and these are really the very oldest Victorian type monuments that you'll find here at Rest Haven. Right now I believe that we are in the oldest part of the oldest section of the cemetery. It started in about 1820, which was about 2 years after Walton County was started. There's approximately 3,000 people that are buried here at Rest Haven, and it's still an active cemetery today. We're going to, in addition to visiting some of the residents here at Rest Haven, we're going to be seeing some Victorian symbolism as well. And the first one that we're going to look at today is right over there. You'll see a taller monument and then a smaller one that looks like a stack of rocks. Can everybody see that? It's right on this line here. You've got this obelisk, and that big monument is the small one right there. That stack of rocks, is that better? Yeah. The stack of rocks you'll see in Victorian cemeteries, that signifies a life built on a firm religious foundation. Now we've got a little area right down here that has quite a bit of symbolism, and that's going to be our next stop. So let's go ahead and go down that way. The group of headstones that we have right in this area, a lot of them are similar, but there are some real subtle differences with meanings that are really different. If you look at this monument here, the Hamilton Monument, and then these two over here that have books on the top of them, you'll see on the front there are opening gates. And the opening gates represent the gates of heaven opening. Now this monument here, at the opening gates, you'll see a crown. That crown represents heavenly reward. Now on these two monuments here, one of them has a crown and a cross, which represents the sovereignty of the Lord, and one of them has a star, and the star represents heavenly wisdom. Now that monument, this monument, and this monument, all three have books on the top. This one has an open book. That open book represents an open Bible, and that represents perfect knowledge. Now if you look at this first monument over here, you'll see a closed book, and the binding is on the left. And that's what a book would look like before you open it up and started reading it from the very beginning. That represents hidden knowledge. That's knowledge that we're not going to know until we get to heaven. The monument next to it has another book, very subtle difference. The spine is on the right. That would be what a book would look like after you've completed reading it, and that represents a completed life. You'll see this monument right here has a shroud on the very top of it. That shroud represents grief. And this monument here has two hands grasping each other. That normally means a husband and a wife, and one has gone first and the other one is pulling the second one towards heaven. And we're going to head right on down this way. Okay, the monument we're at right now, or the gravesite, is the final resting place of Paul Holmes Pascal. And you can see here that he was an attorney. He was the first honor graduate in the class of 1925 of Monroe High School, and an honor graduate of the University of Georgia in the class of 1930. Now, if you look on his headstone, you'll see there were a number of things he was involved in with the Methodist Church, and also historical type things. He was on the Athens Historical Society and Commission on Archives and History and that kind of thing. But the most interesting thing that I've seen on this headstone is he actually wrote a book. It was called This Trail of Splendor and Glory. And what he did was he took his interest in history and his love of the church and wrote a history of the First United Methodist Church of Monroe. Now, he did this in 1974 at the 150th anniversary of the church. Okay, if y'all will look right over here, one of these flat monuments, that's the final resting place of Anita Sams. Now, Miss Sams was from Walton County. She graduated from Monroe High School, and in 1936 she graduated from the University of Georgia with a degree in journalism. She did some work for the Walton Tribune. She was a historian herself, and wrote a book called Wayfarers in Walton. Now, this was a history of Walton County, and it was a pretty complete history. In fact, it's still considered today as the most complete history of Walton County. She also compiled and edited a book about Governor McDaniel. It was his Civil War letters that he wrote to his wife, and it was called With Unabated Trust. And we're going to visit his grave a little bit later. She was one of the founding members of the Historical Society of Walton County, and also was a past president. I personally think it's her being a historian like she was. I think it's really appropriate that she's buried in the oldest, most historical part of this cemetery. If y'all can all look right over this way, we have kind of a small monument. It's Frances Lonnie S, and Frances died in 1904 in his childhood. And there's some symbolism on this monument as well. If you look at the lamb laying in the front, that represents innocence, and you'll see that on children's graves a lot during Victorian times. There's a stump right behind that lamb. It's been cut at the top, and that represents a life cut short. Now, to me, one of the most interesting monuments here at Rest Haven Cemetery is the one that we're standing next to right now. This is a monument in honor or in memory of Matthew Talbot Nunnally. Now, Matthew was from here. In 1859, he received an appointment to the United States Military Academy in New York. He resigned from that school in 1861 to join the Confederate Army, and he was commissioned a captain and was a company commander of Company H of the 11th Georgia Volunteer Infantry. They were also known as the Walton Volunteers. Now, Matthew was killed at the Battle of Gettysburg, and actually is still buried up there. His sister Mary, who's buried right over here behind this monument, offered to shoulder the cost of a Confederate monument here in Monroe if they would use Matthew's likeness. That offer was turned down, so she went ahead and had this monument made and put it over here in Rest Haven Cemetery. Now, this is an actual likeness of Matthew Nunnally. Now, in the early 90s, there was a storm that came through and actually knocked the soldier off the monument. My understanding was it used to be facing a different way, but now it's facing towards the Southlands. You can. Oh, okay, so they had it going north when they were repairing it, and they had him turn it around and faced it south. And you can see some damage on the hat, and there actually used to be a saber on the left side of the statue, and it, of course, has been broken off as well. And we're gonna... If you get on U.S. Highway 78 going from Monroe to Athens, you'll notice that that it's called the Melina Michael Memorial Highway. We're at the final resting place of Melina Michael right now. It's this grave here that has the flowers on the top of it. Now, she was born in Good Hope and received her general education at boarding school. When she came back at age 15, her mother was kind of concerned that there wasn't enough to pay a teacher for a year, so she had Melina go ahead and teach. She taught her first class when she was 15 years old in a log cabin on her father's cotton plantation. Now, when he sold the cotton plantation, they moved up here to Monroe, and she continued teaching to help support the family. She actually ended up being an instructor and an administrator at the University of Georgia. She took a leave of absence during World War I and worked in New York City at the YMCA War Workers Training Center. Now, while she was up there, she had read In Flanders Fields, this is a poem by John McCrae, a number of times. It's a poem that a lot of us had to learn, I guess, in elementary school. It's about the people that are buried in Flanders Fields from World War I. But 2 days before the armistice, this was on November the 9th, 1918, she was reading it, and the second half of it just really got to her. It really impressed her. And it was, to you from failing hands we throw, the torch be yours to hold it high. That's actually on her headstone now. Well, after she read that, right then she decided that she was going to start wearing poppies in memory of those that had died in World War I. And when she came back to the university in 1919, she taught a class that had a number of World War I disabled veterans in it. And she realized then that they still needed help. So she decided she was going to start selling artificial poppies to raise money. And that's something that's gone on worldwide ever since. And hundreds of millions of dollars have been raised because of that. General Pershing wrote her a personal letter, thanking her for her patriotism. Now, she actually wrote a book called The Miracle Flower. I believe we have some of them here on sale under the tent. So we're going to go ahead and head on to our next stop. The grave site we're at next to at this time is the final resting place of General George Justice Hearn. General Hearn enlisted in the National Guard in 1925 and served every enlisted rank until he was commissioned in 1932, a second lieutenant. He served actually for 43 years and was on active duty during the Second World War and the Korean War. In the 1950s, Governor Herman Talmadge appointed him as Adjutant General here in the state of Georgia. 3 additional governors also appointed him, so he went from, 4 additional governors, thank you, appointed him to that, and he held that position from the 1950s up through 1974. At one time, he was the mayor of Monroe. He was the president of the Monroe Golf and Country Club, and was involved in the family business of Hearn Hardware downtown. If y'all will look at this group of monuments right here, the one closest to me is the final resting place of Walter Robeson Cox. Now, Mr. Cox graduated from the University of the South in 1951 and went to work for the Central Intelligence Agency, and he worked there his whole career and was stationed all around the world. Now, when he retired in 1983, he was in charge of the Junior Agent Development Program, and when they got back here to Monroe, he led a group of volunteers that went all around the county looking for old cemeteries and help clean them up and restore them. So that's something we probably still should do today. I know there's a number of old cemeteries around here. Okay, our next stop is really, we can really do it from here. If y'all look right over here, you'll see a larger headstone that has Cresswell on it. Does everybody see that? Well, right next to it is a little smaller monument, and that's the final resting place of Mary Ethel Cresswell. Now, Miss Cresswell was an educator by trade. She began doing this in 1901, and in 1919 she became the first woman ever to receive a baccalaureate degree from the University of Georgia. She went and worked for a while at the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C., and became the first woman supervisor there. She also received a distinguished alumni award from the University of Georgia for service to the university. And she was the first woman to have done that. So she was a real, I think, pioneer and pace setter in her time. Now, if you're familiar with the university, there's a residence hall there. It's called Cresswell Hall. It houses about 1,000 students. Well, that building is named in her memory. She was also the first dean of the School of Home Economics, and she was an instructor there even after she retired. I think in just about any cemetery that you go to that's been around for a while, you'll see some pretty unusual things, and this cemetery really is no exception. We're right now at the final resting place of J.P. Riker, and he was known as the Old German. Now, he moved to town here and took odd jobs and worked and lived in rental rooms and that kind of thing. And when he passed away in 1948, nobody came to claim his body. So his body stayed at the funeral home for quite some time. Eventually, the city of Monroe buried him here at Rest Haven. Now, when they first buried him, the gravedigger decided it would be nice for him to have a headstone. So he put the headstone out here, and you can see it's really a homemade headstone. Later on, a couple of citizens from here in town put a regular headstone in, and both of them are still here. And the thing I really like about the original one that was homemade, it has the old German was buried here 2/24/1948. German and buried are both misspelled. We're at the Lonnie S family plot right now. It's this plot back here where the cross is. The fourth monument down is in memory of PFC Harry Lonnie S Jr. Now, Harry was an honor graduate from Monroe High School in 1943 and went to the Citadel for a year before he joined the U.S. Army. He was killed in action at the Battle of the Bulge in early 1945, and he's actually buried in Luxembourg in the military cemetery there. His family had this monument put here in his memory. They also had the Memorial Library built on Bowl Springs Drive in memory of all of those that died in World War II. And at the First United Methodist Church here in town, there's a Harry Lonnie S Jr. a memorial chapel. It was built in his memory, funded by his folks. If you ever get down that way, if you're in front of the chapel, you'll see a portrait of Harry in his military uniform. His awards are there as well, and there's also a picture of the Luxembourg Cemetery as well as a snapshot of his actual grave. And his monument here indicates that he is buried over there. So this is here in his memory. As we come into this section of the cemetery, you'll notice that the monuments here look a little different than the ones that we were just at. They're a little more modern. Originally, this was a memorial park. You can see there's still a wall and a gate here. There's the Alma Knight Allen Memorial Park. As the cemetery grew, it just continued to come on back here and sort of took over the park. I understand at one time there was a pond down here at the very bottom. In every college team, or college, I guess, that has any type of a sports team, you're going to have fans, and fan stands for fanatic. And I think right now we're at the final resting place of somebody that was probably the biggest fan of the University of Georgia football team. If y'all will look right up here, you'll see the Scott Monument. To the right is the final resting place of Herschel Bulldog Scott. And you can see by looking at his monument that he was Bulldog born, Bulldog bred, and here he lies, Bulldog dead. Now, I understand that he actually had his name in the phone book, Mr. Bulldog, and he'd go around town asking children to say the magic phrase. And if they said, "How about them dogs?" he'd give them a quarter and a little Bulldog card. He set a record that I don't know will ever be broken. He went to 471 consecutive Georgia football games, which includes home, away, and bowl games. He started in the 60s doing that. Vince Dooley came to his funeral, and he mentioned while he was here that he remembered Mr. Scott, and he said he'd be there when they got off the bus at the stadium and when they got back on. And he said somehow when they go back to the hotel, Mr. Scott would be at the hotel for him to get back off the bus again. So he really was a big fan. Also in every cemetery you'll find heroes. And normally when I think of heroes that are buried in cemeteries, I think of people that were in the military that did unusually brave things in very frightening and stressful situations. We're at the final resting place right now of Victor Franklin Grubbs. And Mr. Grubbs was a World War II veteran. He was a B-17 pilot in World War II, but he really became a hero, I think, in March of 1977. if you're able to look at this monument, there's pictures of 3 airplanes. There's a little 2-seater, there's a B-17, and there's a Boeing 747. Mr. Grubbs was a captain for Pan Am Airlines, and he was flying a charter from New York to the Canary Islands over off of Africa. He was supposed to be landing at the Las Palmas island, but he had gotten information that there had been some terrorist activity there, so he was rerouted to Tenerife. That's another one of the Canary Islands. Now, a number of planes had been rerouted to Tenerife that day, and when he landed, there were he and one other 747. It was a KLM Dutch Airlines 747, and this was a small airport. It only had one runway. Well, they were there for about 3 hours, and while they were there, a fog rolled in, so there was really very little visibility. Well, the tower told the KLM plane to go ahead and taxi down to the end of the runway and then turn around and wait for further instructions. They told the Pan Am that Captain Grubbs was on to go ahead and follow down that runway, which is what he did. Now, they couldn't see each other because of the fog, and somehow the KLM pilot thought he had been cleared for takeoff. So he went ahead and started his roll down that runway. He started picking up speed, and Captain Grubbs was the first one to notice what was happening. So when he saw that plane coming, he turned his hard left and really cranked the engines up, trying to get out of the way. Well, at the very last minute, the KLM pilot realized what he had done, and he pulled back on that stick. And he started angling up so fast that the tail was throwing sparks off the runway. Now, he had a full fuel load. He had fueled up while he was there. He almost made it past the Pan Am plane, but he didn't. He took off the top of the Pan Am plane, went on down the runway, and exploded, killing all 248 people on that plane. Now, Captain Grubbs, because of his efforts, I think heroic efforts of trying to get off that runway, 61 people survived. 583 people died that day, and it's still the largest air disaster in world history. In my mind, it would have been a lot worse if it hadn't been for Captain Grubbs being at the stick. We're at the World War II monument now. This is in memory of those who gave their lives in World War II so that we could be free. My father was a World War II veteran, and I firmly believe that generation did save the world. Just a little personal aside here. We gave this tour 2 years ago, and we had a World War II veteran that was with us that day. His name was Buster Harris. He was a friend of mine, and Buster passed away this past week, but he's been on my mind. If you look here at the very end, you'll see a monument in memory of Colonel Robert Echols. Now, Colonel Echols was born in Walton County. He served in the state legislature and in the state senate. He ran for the U.S. House and lost to his opponent by 2 votes. His opponent was General Cobb. During the Mexican War, he served as a colonel in command of the 13th U.S. Infantry, and he was killed while he was in Mexico. Now, most people you would think that were killed in a war, you would think they were killed in a battle of some sort. What happened, unfortunately, to Colonel Echols is he was on his horse in a dress parade, and he fell off his horse and it killed him. He was buried for a time there in Mexico. Eventually, they exhumed his body and moved him back to Walton County. Now, I've done a little research on this, and there's some question in my mind as to whether he is really buried here. Some of the things that I've seen say that he was buried in his family cemetery, In some things it shows it was off kind of off Highway 81. But whether or not he's buried here, we do have a monument here for him. If he's not here, this is called a cenotaph. And what a cenotaph is just that, a monument for somebody that's not buried here. Rather than go up to the very end, I'll tell you just from here. Excuse me. There's a grave site up here for Elihu Mansfield Carnes. Now, Mr. Carnes was known as Monroe's photographer, and he's got that written right on his grave. He died in 1957, and when he died, my understanding is he was the oldest active photographer in the state of Georgia. He wasn't originally from here. He was coming through Monroe to go to Florida, and the story is that while he was here, he met a lady and fell in love, and stayed here for the rest of his life. And of course, now being buried here, his studio was over on Broad Street, kind of across the street from the Art Guild. There's a White House. That was where his studio was. If everybody can look right over this way, you'll see the Coker plot. There are 3 graves there. The one in the middle, the metal marker that has the American flag next to it, is the final resting place of Dennis Coker. Now, Dennis was from here in Monroe. He graduated from Monroe High School in 1963, and he was really active there at Monroe. He played football. He's number 74 for the Hurricanes. He ran track. He was in the Beta Club. He got a scholastic M. He was just really overall involved in the school. Now, after he graduated, he went to Georgia Tech, and while he was at Georgia Tech, he participated in the ROTC program. So when he graduated from there, he was commissioned a second lieutenant in the U.S. Army Infantry. Well, he went ahead to flight school to learn to fly helicopters. He was stationed both in Texas and in southeast Georgia. And in September of 1968, he was sent to Vietnam. Now, he served with the 1st Aviation Brigade, and his particular unit was southwest of Saigon. He served there for 6 months before he was killed in action. As far as I know, he's the only Vietnam KIA that's buried here at Rest Haven Cemetery. But while he was there for those 6 months, some of the awards he received was the Bronze Star, the Purple Heart, and he received 21 air medals. 21 air medals. Now, you get those air medals for a certain number of combat danger flights that you take. So in just 6 months, he earned enough. Say 25 for one. So kind of do the math. 25 times 21. He was in the air quite a bit. Ironically, he was not killed in the air. He was killed in a rocket attack on his position there, southwest of Saigon. The Dennis Coker Park here in Monroe City Park is named in his memory. Georgia Tech fans do we have out here today? I see a few hands going up. We're at the final resting place of Robert Alva Clay. And if you look at his headstone or his monument, it will tell you that he played all 4 quarters of the game. He was known as the Kid, and he is a member of the Georgia Tech Athletic Hall of Fame. He grew up here in Monroe. He enrolled in Georgia Tech in 1910, and in 1915 was awarded an electrical engineering degree. He went ahead and took a job in the experimental engineering department there at Georgia Tech. He was also an assistant coach in football under John Heisman, that the trophy is named after, and an assistant baseball coach. Now, his career was interrupted during World War I, and he was a lieutenant in the 82nd Division and served in the Argonne Forest and saw action there. Upon returning, he came back to Georgia Tech and was an assistant coach in football, and in 1921 became the head baseball coach. He served in that capacity until 1931, and in those 11 seasons, he won 3 conference championships. After he left Georgia Tech, he went to Riverside Military Academy up in Gainesville, and served as the football coach up there for 5 years. He died in 1946 of a heart attack, and ironically, he died in Monroe, Louisiana. We're at the Mitchum family plot right now, this particular plot right here. At the very back, the second monument from the right is the final resting place of LSU Mitchum. Now, on December the 7th, 1946, LSU was killed at age 16 in what remains the worst hotel fire in U.S. history. She was killed in the Winecoff fire in downtown Atlanta. Now, she went to Gainesville High School, and she was in the Tri-High Y Club, and she and 3 of her classmates were elected to go down to Atlanta and participate in a mock legislature. So they did that so that children around the state could get some experience doing that kind of thing. They were in room 1130, and 30 rooms were on the south side of the hotel. It faced another building, so they had louvers in the windows, so you couldn't really get out. When the fire started, they think it started on that side, and it spread pretty quickly. When the Atlanta Fire Department got there, they realized that their equipment couldn't go up any higher than about the 6th floor. So a number of people were trapped in the hotel. 119 people died that day. LSU was buried here because this is her hometown. The 3 other girls are buried in Gainesville. I think it's kind of interesting that if you go to downtown Atlanta now, the building is still there and it's still in use. It's called the LS Hotel in downtown Atlanta. My guess is not many people that stay there know about its history. Can everybody see the Greer monument right over here? It's just is next to this bush here. It's just to the right. You'll see Joseph K. and Bessie Moore Greer are both buried there. Now I understand they had a boarding house here in Monroe, and they had a son, and his name was Joseph K. Greer Jr. Now he went to Monroe High School here, went on to college and graduated, and went to the University of North Carolina to take some graduate courses. Originally, he wanted to be an architect, but decided he'd rather move inside and be an interior decorator. And as it turns out, he was pretty much a world-renowned interior decorator. He helped decorate the Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson White House. And Mary Martin and Ethel Merman and Joan Fontaine were some of his clients. He was drafted in World War II into the Army Air Force, and he was drafted as a private, served both in World War II and Korea, and when he came out, he was a major. Now, he moved to New York City, and as he gained fame, he legally changed his name to Richard Greer. He was found murdered in the late 1970s in his apartment, and his remains were cremated, and he's buried between his parents here at this particular gravesite. Okay, if everybody can just kind of take a look right over here, we're at the Camp Burns plot. This monument here on the very front is the final resting place of Ernest Camp Sr. Now, Mr. Camp was originally from South Georgia. He worked in the newspaper business, and in 1906, he and his wife and their infant son came up here to Monroe, and he bought the Walton Tribune. The family actually owned it for 70 years. They sold it in 1976. He was the publisher for 50 years. He was a poet. He wrote some books of poetry. He was a poet laureate of the Georgia Press Association and was also the president of that organization. And he is a member of the University of Georgia Henry Grady School of Journalism Hall of Fame. He had 3 children, and one of them was, let's see, it's further back over here in the very back. Thanks. Sanders Camp. Now, Sanders also worked in the newspaper business. He graduated from Monroe High School and also from Georgia Tech. Now, during World War II, he was an artillery officer in the China-Burma India theater. After the war ended, he worked for a couple of years for the OSS, which became the CIA later on. Now, when he came back to Monroe, he joined the Georgia National Guard, and in 1963 retired as a brigadier general. And my understanding is he and General Hearn were good friends. Now, he was also the president of the Georgia Press Association and is in the Journalism Hall of Fame there at the University of Georgia. And this is the only two father and son team that have ever done that. Now, we can do the next one from right here. If everybody looks right over here, there's an old monument, has Stroud on the bottom of it. That's in memory of Orion Stroud and his first wife, Milka. Now, this monument has not always been here at Rest Haven Cemetery. It was in the Stroud Family Cemetery on A.H. Atha Road until the 1940s, when some of the family decided it would be better taken care of over here. So it was moved. 2 shovels full of dirt were taken from the grave sites and moved over here as well. Now, Milka died young, and Orion remarried. He married a lady by the name of Martha Walker. She was the widow of Daniel Walker, and she's buried with Daniel down at the Old Baptist Cemetery. They had one child. Her name was Ella, and she married into the Nunnally family. Y'all remember the Confederate statue up there? It was his brother. His name was Aaron Nunnally. They had children, and they lived in Atlanta. It's kind of a small world because I do tours at Oakland Cemetery, and Aaron, Mr. and Ms. Aaron Walker are buried there at Oakland Cemetery. And if you ever go down there, some of their children are buried there with them too, and one of their children's name is Orion Stroud Nunnally. Now, if you look at the corners of that monument, you'll see upside down torches. Now, that's symbolism. That's Victorian symbolism. That represents a life that's been snuffed out. The McDaniel, Tishner, Warfield family plot right now. Monroe is known as the town of governors, and the reason for that is there have been 6 Georgia governors with some connection to Monroe, and also 1 Texas governor. Now, I mention that because we're at the final resting place right now of Henry McDaniel. Henry McDaniel was a Georgia governor. Now, he grew up here. He went to Mercer University and got his law degree, and came back to Monroe and practiced law with his uncle. At the beginning, just before the Civil War got started, there was a secession convention, and he was the youngest member of that convention. He originally voted against secession, but before it ended, he voted for. So that was when the state of Georgia seceded from the Union. Now, Henry McDaniel practiced what he preached. He went ahead and joined the Confederate Army, and he served under Captain Nunnally, who we just talked about a little while ago. He was there that day at Gettysburg when Nunnally was killed. Now, they found out pretty quickly that he really was quite a leader, because as the officers above him were killed, he actually took the unit over and did quite a job. Now, 8 days after the Battle of Gettysburg ended, in a battle in Funkstown, Maryland, Governor McDaniel was shot in the stomach and spent the rest of the war in hospitals and in prisoner of war camps. Now, while he was there, he wrote letters to the love of his life, Hester Felker. And Hester is buried next to him here. Her father, Stephen Felker, for some reason didn't like Henry McDaniel very much. Nobody really knows why. I think probably those of us that have daughters know that really nobody is good enough for our little girl. And maybe that's what he thought. But they were married for 60 years, so I like to think that Mr. Felker realized that he was wrong. Now, after Henry came back from the war, he went into politics. He served in the House of Representatives, the State House of Representatives, and in the State Senate. And when Governor Alexander Stephens died in office, he was elected in a special election to take his place. He served that that term and then was reelected to a term of his own. While he was there, he was there when Georgia Tech started and also when the state capitol was built. When he came back to Monroe, he, for the rest of his life, practiced law and took care of his business interests. And as I mentioned, Hester Felker McDaniel is buried here next to him. Two down, Gypsy McDaniel Tishner, that's their daughter, is buried there with her husband. Now, Governor and Ms. McDaniel lived on McDaniel Street in the McDaniel Tishner house, and his daughter and her husband lived across the street. They moved into their house when the McDaniels passed away, and the family was actually in that house until the early 1990s. But that's why it's called the McDaniel Tishner house. Folks, that wraps up the tour for today. I hope y'all have enjoyed taking the tour. I've really enjoyed giving it to you. There are just so many interesting things that you see in cemeteries, especially those like this that have been around for a long time. One thing that I do remember is when I was 12 years old, my grandfather died. And it was the first time anybody had ever died that I knew. And I remember at that funeral, my mother told me, as long as somebody's remembered, they're not really gone. And I believe that. So when you have time sometime, just come up here and walk to the cemetery and just remember some of the folks that are buried here.